Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 105th video in our second Master Series, the 54th video on basic processors, the 17th video on sculpting processors, and our first video on saturation. And this is our intro video. So kind of bear with me for a minute because I got a couple notes that I kind of want to go over. First of all, that there are about 10 videos at the beginning of this sculpting processors series before we get into noise, and you definitely want to go through and look at those because they give you a lot of insight into the uses of these processors. So go back and make sure you've watched them. You might want to watch them again to refresh yourself with them. The next thing we want to talk about is that saturation works with noise. The concept here is that saturation and noise are very close to the same family. And saturation is normally a little bit more aggressive type of distortion, whereas noise is a much lower level type of distortion. But they very much work together. They will most definitely be a little out of phase of each other, and they will be blending and fusing together to add the elements of each other together that have a different effect other than them by themselves, which takes a lot of experimentation and practice to really understand this concept of how closely they work together. So really keep that in mind. So as you start doing your saturation, you may be adjusting your noise and saturation levels until you get them blending and fusing and having the correct effect, and that's okay. And it's very experimental a lot of times, so just have patience. The other thing is that saturation is a light distortion of the timbre and or the sinusoids in the timbre. So it's affecting the sinusoid. So whenever you're looking at, saturation, it's not really full spectrum. You have like noise that looks like this. It's all the way across the spectrum. And when you look at a timbre, that you can't really see it as well. You'll see noise in there mixed with the saturation, but you see a lot of these little spikes really low along these sinusoids that are up as far as the timbre is concerned, that's a lot of saturation. You can see the saturation at the lower ends. As it goes up higher in the spectrum, it starts to really blend with the sinusoids until the saturation, the noise, and the sinusoids about become close to the same levels and fused and blended together. But you can actually see some of the saturation, the sideband distortion and saturation and things like that along the sides of these sinusoids in this timbre. So really keep in mind that it's a little bit louder than noise, but it's along the same levels. When you saturate, saturation is going to sometimes add even harmonics, odd harmonics, even and odd harmonics, saturation like clipping saturation and things like that. There's when you overdrive the speed capabilities of a circuit that you get like a triangle wave saturation, and sometimes harmonic distortion that's not even or odd harmonic. And when you clipping distortion and getting saturation from that, you'll get an odd harmonics, whereas the other side, overdriving speed capabilities gets even harmonics. And so there are two different saturations. Sometimes you add odd, saturation, odd harmonic saturation, even harmonic saturation, both of them. And sometimes you're trying to get clipping full spectrum saturation that's adding those type of harmonics, and non-harmonic distortion, that's another type of saturation. So it gets a little complicated. So you really kind of got to dig in it. There's a bunch of videos on my channel, but we'll look at that a little bit. as we go along when we add different types of saturation in there. So, and it's not full spectrum. It's normally working off of the fundamental, the root, and the other harmonics inherently in there, that it may be warping some or all of those sinusoids. You know, you have a sinusoid that's in there, it's warping one or more of them to a point that's causing other harmonics and saturation to develop from theirs, which you have to read a little bit about that, and there's as much videos on my channel. It gets all complicated because you get a bunch of sinusoids together and they create, you see them in the dots here, they create this complex waveform. Well, as you warp any of them, you can cause saturation, clipping, distortion, even and odd harmonics, non-harmonic distortion, all kinds of things, which works out to saturation that you see all over the place in this timbre. So really keep that in mind. And as you start experimenting with that, you will start to understand that more and more and more, what even and odd harmonics, as far as using them for saturation do, or even and odd harmonics together, or clipping, distortion, saturation, or something like that. So, but we'll look at that when we get into like trash too, the different types of saturations that we're causing from trying to warp sinusoids to cause that, which it can also cause even and odd harmonics, which we'll be using when we do distortion and the harmonic work later on. But it's more of a low level thing, that when you have a timbre, you know, the most subtle sound is the noise that's inherent in the timbre. After that, the transducer in your vocal cords, let's say, is warping the sinusoids at some point that causes distortion and saturation, which working together with the noise causes a type of noise saturation effect that it doesn't, they're not just clean sinusoids. If you just get on your synthesizer and put a bunch of all these sinusoids together to make a timbre, it won't quite sound the same. It sounds too sterile and dry, and it doesn't sound like a voice. That's why when you hear people do like, you know, robot sounds, you know, and they're trying to, that you talk to an automated system, that they're trying to replicate a human voice, that it, without all that other complex components in it, that it sounds like a bunch of sinusoids that you've tried to shape into a sound, which doesn't have all that other distortion, saturations, and things like that in it, and noise that cause it to have more of a natural sound like the transducer that is your voice. So just take your time when we're going through this. We're going to go through it and look at different processors to apply saturation, and then it's going to be more of you understanding of applying it and experimenting around with it, because the concept's pretty simple. Once we start looking at the processors that are applying it, it'll become real obvious what we're doing, and then you'll understand that how it and noise work really closely together to affect the timbre, which is a bunch of sinusoids. Does that make sense? And distortion can be the same thing. Distortion is a more aggressive saturation that, you know, let's say an example is that I've got a sound that's mostly even harmonics, and I start adding odd harmonics as a distortion to affect that sound. So you'd start bringing odd harmonics that aren't part of that actual sound, that would be more seen as distortion, that is going to change the timbre of that sound, because it's adding odd harmonics, blending them with even harmonics at lower levels but higher than saturation normally would be, that has a more prominent effect on the sound. Distortion. Does that make sense? So just kind of take a, you know, take that, let that soak in. Make sure you've watched those previous videos. There's like 10 videos on when we started the sculpting processors that give a lot of insight to how to utilize the processors that we're using. And then we're going to get into start looking at the processors. The first one we're going to start out with is Trash 2, that it may be trash from Isotope, but it does a really good job. And then we'll look at some other plugins that add saturation. We'll also look at synth applications, and we'll look at trying to create saturation files that we can add in and do bandpass filtering on them to try to add them into certain envelopes of sound, because every sound has an envelope of sound, and it's normally within a certain range that we can try to inject it into the sound file. So I hope that's a simple enough intro as we get into saturation. I certainly hope you enjoyed the noise segment, and we're going to jump right into the processor starting with trash 2. So peace, soap, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this intro to saturation, and I will see you in the next video.